Discrepant Verbal Nonverbal Profile Theory. The Study of Discrepant Communication by Katie Moody. What did they mean by that? So we've all experienced instances where someone has said something, but their tone sounded like they meant something else. And oftentimes this occurs in our personal lives, but it's also common in professional settings too. So if you're like me, this type of communication makes you feel uneasy or anxious about the encounter or about how the person feels about you. Are they mad at me? Did I do something? This is discrepant communication. So in professional settings, this can happen when an employee receives a project they aren't excited about and says something along the lines of, well, great, I definitely have time for that. But their tone implies they're not enthusiastic about their new assignment. In personal settings, this type of communication is common among families and romantic relationships, and it can have a particular impact on childhood development, and it also says a lot about the health of a romantic relationship. Continued discrepant communication can result in something called the reciprocal cycle, and this is where a person expresses a discrepant message and is met with a discrepant response, further deteriorating the communication. So BuzzFeed actually published an article last month that showed that most people between the ages of 16 and 29 found that there are at least 10 emojis that can make someone seem old, but not just old. Some think that the thumbs up emoji, for example, can be perceived as hostile and passive aggressive. So if you're like me, you grew up thinking the thumbs up emoji just meant awesome, that's great. But apparently that's not the case. And so certain emojis are now taboo and can imply hostility or passive aggressiveness, and this illustrates the importance of being aware of how we communicate with others, whether it be in person, over the phone, via text message, or email. So there are impacts of discrepant communication. So they're typically negative, especially on the outcomes of communication, and can also be detrimental to relationships. Research shows that discrepant communication can cause uncertainty or anxiety in relationships. It has impacts on childhood development and how children develop their personalities and their own communication styles, and it can ultimately result in unsuccessful communication. So research related to discrepant communication mostly focuses on childhood development, relationships, and the link between verbal and nonverbal communication. Specifically on childhood development, research by Friend and Judith found that children around the ages of 4 and 7 were less likely to recognize discrepant messaging, whereas older children, age 10, were more likely to recognize when someone was communicating discrepantly. This illustrates that discrepant communication is learned and isn't actually innate. Additionally, an article published by the BBC this year said that studies found sarcasm use, another form of discrepant communication, illustrates maturity among adolescents. This study showed that using sarcasm requires individuals to use a different part of their brain, and so that also illustrates that discrepant communication is learned versus we're born with it. So research cited by Grabelski and Lichtman found that the use of discrepant communication among parents and children can also be a sign of poor family functioning, and it can impact how children develop their personalities and their communication styles. However, there have been instances where discrepant communication can be used strategically and interpreted positively among children. A good example of this is when a parent uses positive reinforcement to redirect a child's behavior. In romantic relationships, as said before, most often discrepant communication is perceived negatively by the message receiver. Thus, when it's used in romantic relationships, it's usually an indicator of a breakdown in communication. Additionally, Grabelski and Lichtman found that discrepant communication can lead to uncertainty and anxiety, which when used in a romantic relationship, it can make the receiver question what the problem is and question their own actions to cause such a message. In fact, research by Manusov and colleagues found that when a romantic partner uses a change of tone when communicating, it's typically an indicator of a relationship failing. This is an example of discrepant communication being a sign of the health of a relationship. Research into verbal and nonverbal communication focuses on the entire context of a communication encounter, finding that there are many factors that contribute to how someone communicates verbally versus nonverbally. There are also examples in previous research that cites voluntary and involuntary instances of discrepant communication. Research also looks at discrepant expressiveness and discrepant responsiveness and their impacts on communication. When individuals use discrepant expressions and are met with discrepant responses, it can lead to the reciprocal cycle of communication, which can contribute to unsuccessful communication and have implications on the relationship between the two communicators. So this is typically when someone expresses a discrepant message and they're met with a discrepant response. So it leads to that reciprocal cycle of discrepant communication. Ekman cites facial expressions as an example of involuntary nonverbal communication, where an individual expresses their emotions through their facial expressions. The main example cited in this research is smiling. There are many different types of smiles that express different emotions. The research found that while someone can smile because they're actually enjoying the encounter, they can also bar their teeth and express anger with a smile. They can also express sarcasm or disgust with a smile during a communication encounter. So this is a type of involuntary discrepant communication, as facial expressions give away our emotions. Discrepant messages and technology. Discrepant communication is also prevalent in messages sent via technology, such as text messages and emails. Certain emojis have been found to communicate hostility or aggressiveness, despite their intended meaning. Additionally, particularly short messages can also signal hostility or anger. However, individuals utilizing text messaging are encouraged to keep messages brief as to not overwhelm the recipients, specifically in professional communication encounters. In emails and text messages, punctuation can send discrepant messages. Exclamation points can portray aggressiveness when they're intended to express excitement or enthusiasm about a project. Direction for future research. An area where future research should be directed is the reciprocal cycle and how it can impact future communication encounters. It would also be of interest to determine the impact of continued discrepant communication on established relationships, such as that between a mother and daughter who have consistently communicated discrepantly. Another area for future research would be how to redirect discrepant communication to avoid entering the reciprocal cycle. In conclusion, research has shown that discrepant communication can be detrimental to relationships and communication among individuals. It's typically perceived as negative and is associated with negative impacts on relationships and communication outcomes. It is also important for individuals to be able to recognize when they are communicating discrepantly and when they are receiving discrepant communication, since these types of messages can be sent voluntarily and involuntarily. Lastly, it's important for individuals to pay attention not only to what they say, but how they say it.